Hello everyone, Santir here, and welcome to the Illusion Magic attribute line skill review of my Mesmer part of my skill review project for Guild Wars 1. And we're going to go ahead and jump right into it with Accumulated Pain. So this is 5 energy, 2 second cast time, 12 second recharge, spell. Target foe takes 63 damage. If that foe is suffering from 2 or more hexes, that foe suffers a deep wound for 17 seconds. So this is a reward for stacking hexes on a single enemy, and I appreciate that a skill like this exists. It's a nice sort of reward skill, and you want to have skills that reward you for accomplishing specific goals, and this one is specifically for stacking hexes on an enemy. Now, this can be any hex, and in general, if I'm going to try to bring Accumulated Pain, I'm going to be bringing this on a hex sort of themed team build. So like with necromancers that are using some of their very area of effect hexes and things like that. That said, I think Accumulated Pain is kind of good in that situation and can be made to work in others, but I'm going to give this a 2 because this is really... So the 63 damage is okay that this deals, but I'm going to want something from... Like if I just want damage like this, excuse me, I'm going to want like Spiritual Pain from Domination Magic, or something like that. If I'm going to be bringing this, I specifically want to be able to get the deep wound. So this is going to have specific situations where I want to use it. And if I'm not matching those situations, it's just really not worth bringing, if that makes sense. But it is a nice additional reward for matching the condition. Air of Disenchantment. 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 10 second recharge, elite hex spell. Remove 1 enchantment from target foe and all nearby foes. For 17 seconds, enchantments expire 270% faster on those foes. So this makes enchantments like end really quickly if they get enchanted after this is applied. So this is elite enchantment removal. And it does have it going for it. That's a pretty big area of effect. And it has a very quick recharge. So I'm going to give this a 2. I'm going to give this a 2 specifically because, okay, so there was a situation where I would use this. And that situation is specifically if I'm going into an area where I know the enemies have a lot of enchantments that I'm going to want to remove, and they're going to be spamming them quite a bit. That's very narrow. And so I would consider bringing this if this was not an elite. Here's the problem. This skill is competing directly with this little non-elite skill down here called Mirror of Disenchantment. Obviously, we'll talk about this skill when we get to the no attribute skills, but this does not require an attribute. It is less energy, it is a longer recharge, but it is not an elite, and it removes an enchantment from target foe, and all of that foe's party members also lose that same enchantment. This is basically going to be doing a very similar thing to what Air of Disenchantment is doing. It's obviously not identical, but if there's something like an Aegis that they're using that's applying enchantment to all of their party members, that's going to be something I want to remove. Or if they're, say, Raptors in the Eye of the North that all use an Assassin enchantment that allows them to block 75% of attacks, and I want to remove that from all of them, I'm going to want Mirror of Disenchantment over Air of Disenchantment because it does not have the area of effect requirement, and it's going to be getting rid of that specific thing I don't want just fine. Obviously, this is a little bit more versatile, but the thing is, in terms of being able to remove a motley collection of enchantments and then making them end a lot faster is really cool. This is a much better skill for the AI to use than for players to use, just because if I'm using this as a player, I'm just not going to be getting the most out of my elite slot. I need my elite to be doing something very powerful, and this is something very powerful, but it's very niche and very specific, and so it has to be a situation where that effect is worth my elite slot, and most of the time it's not. So if this was not an elite, I'd be happy to bring it probably some percentage of the time, but not all of the time. Because its greatest effect is, like, honestly, if this wasn't elite, it would actually probably be a little too good. Because you would be able to get rid of, you'd be able to get the AoE enchantment removal, regardless of the hex effect. So thinking about it that way, like this is a really awkwardly designed skill in that it kind of needs to be an elite because its base effect is so strong. But at the same time, the additional hex effect is quite powerful, but as an elite, it's just not quite good enough. So I could see using this in something like PvP where you want to get rid of enchantments, but in PvE, it's just not competing high enough for that elite slot. So Ancestor's Visage is actually an identical skill to, where is it? Sympathetic Visage, so one of our last skills. They do the exact same thing. They are 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge, enchantment spell. For 9 seconds, whenever target ally is hit by a melee attack, all adjacent foes lose all adrenaline and 3 energy. So that's what these two skills do. Again, they're identical. Factions did a thing where they added duplicates of skills. Because they're identical, you can actually get them up to 100% uptime, just alternating between them. This effect is extraordinarily powerful at stopping melee attackers from being able to do any, use any attack skills on you, because when they hit you, they lose all of their adrenaline. All of their friends near you lose all of their adrenaline. But that's nice. But them all losing 3 energy also. So if you have 3 melee attackers on you, they all hit you, they all cause each other to all lose 3 energy. You can cause them to just drain all of their energy very, very, very quickly. That said, that's not actually terribly useful. I would rather be using something that actually defends me against their auto attack damage. In the monk line, for example, I would want to be using something like Guardian to make half of their attacks not hit. Or I'd rather be using a warrior stance or something to be able to defend myself. Something along those lines that's going to more that's going to be able to reduce auto attack damage. This effect is historically notable because there was a farming build that made use of it in an area where enemies used a ranger skill that meant whenever their energy hit 0, they would take a hit of damage, around 27 damage or so. So you could alternate Ancestor's Visage and Sympathetic Visage on yourself, and that would cause you to the enemies would basically just nuke themselves because it would their energy would constantly be ticking up just a little bit and then get knocked down to 0 by Ancestor's Visage. And so every time that happened, they would take a hit. That farm was really cool, really innovative, really neat, and doesn't work now because of the way skills were changed. I guess it could almost kind of work if you did it just right, but anyway, that farm basically died. So here we are. These skills are much more interesting for the enemies to use. Again, there's a number of Mesmer skills that are like this, where it's interesting when the enemy uses it because it forces the player to recognize what's happening and react accordingly. But Ancestor's Visage and Sympathetic Visage in PvE in particular are just... They're so... they're very good at a very specific thing. That very specific thing is just largely irrelevant. I'm actually going to give them both 1s. They are useful maybe in a very specific, very narrow farming situation, but that's dubious at best. So I'm going to be honest here and be very blunt and just say I'm not going to use these in PvE the vast majority of the time, just because the effect, while potent, again, they can just target somebody else, and it only works on melee attacks, and it does not actually stop damage. So, it's not doing enough of what I actually need. I could maybe see trying to make it work in some sort of energy denial build, but honestly, I think you're better off using other skills in that sort of situation. You're better off loading up with assassins running Fear Me or something in that sort of situation, I think. Okay, Arcane Conundrum. 10 energy, 2 second cast time, 20 second recharge, hex spell. For 13 seconds, spells cast by target foe and all adjacent foes, so it is AoE, which is good, take twice as long to cast. When this hex ends, you gain 6 energy. This is interesting. I would need to actually try this one out. the 6 energy gain on end, if this is triggering off of each one, this does work as a sort of pseudo energy management. I typically don't bring this because making spells take twice as long to cast is what that effect primarily does is it increases vulnerability a little bit. So what I mean by that is making them when you're casting spells you can't move, so it roots them in place longer while they're casting spells, which makes it easier to like attack them or whatever with a melee attacker, and it also makes it easier to interrupt their spells. So like a 1 second cast time going up to 2 seconds. 2 seconds is so much easier to interrupt than a 1 second. 1 second, if you get kind of good and have good ping and all that sort of stuff, isn't too bad. But anyway, that slowing down is nice, but not quite worth a skill slot. The energy gain on ends could make up for that, kind of, if this kind of works as energy management. Let's go ahead and test that out, actually. It's significant enough that I'm going to go ahead and go to Great Temple of Balthazar to check it out. Okay, let's see how this works. So I've applied this. Now we have to wait 13 seconds for this to end, and we'll see how much energy we gain from it. If we gain 6 energy, because this should theoretically have hit 3 targets, right? Practice, yeah, okay. So you do gain energy for each foe that it's on. So this has some utility as a energy management skill. That bumps it up considerably for me. If it didn't have that, I would rate it aggressively lowly. I'm going to go ahead back to Destiny Scourge. It'll be hard to reposition myself where I was, but that's okay. Because of the energy management property, I'm going to go ahead and rate this a 3, I think. Without that property, it is significantly less exciting. But because of that potential to be able to gain you a bunch of energy, I think it's actually okay. So we're going to go ahead and roll with that 3 there. Calculated risk. This is a peculiar one. So it's 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 7 second recharge, which is really quick. Hex spell. For 20 seconds, target foe's attacks do plus 10 damage, but there's a 50% chance that the damage from each attack will be done to that foe instead. Maximum of 83 damage. Excuse me. I don't know quite why that maximum was there, but... So this is... It's very quick recharging. Plus 10 damage is a pretty big downside when it hits you and a pretty big upside when it hits the foe. So if we think about this math a little bit, this is obviously you're going to be taking, let's see, plus 10 damage on half of the attacks, but half of the attacks don't hit you. I legitimately don't know quite where to place this skill. I haven't really used it a whole lot. It's a marginally newer skill, and I tend to find myself in domination magic more than illusion magic, just because I find domination magic is quite good. Calculated risks low recharge makes it, and low energy cost makes it fairly palatable. It's not quite a 50% decrease in damage, because that of the plus 10 damage that they deal. However, it's a weird mix between like blurred vision and empathy, and that makes it really, really hard to evaluate. So thinking about the skill a little bit, I feel like I'm going to give it a 3. Again, these are my ratings. Maybe you've used it and you're like, oh, that skill's not very good, or you've used it and you're like, oh, that skill's amazing. I feel like it's something that I would need to get some experience with to determine just how good it is or isn't. My gut instinct, just kind of reading it, is kind of an uncertainty. It feels like it could be good, and it feels like it could be bad. So I'm going to kind of just middle of road it there. I like this effect. I like something like this that's hard to evaluate and hard to kind of analyze. You don't want most of your skills to be that way, but you do want some of them to be that way. And so this is one that I think is probably worth giving some attention to and giving some time to. And that's part of what this evaluation is to reevaluate some skills I maybe have overlooked. Clumsiness. 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 8-second recharge, hex spell. For 4 seconds, target and adjacent foes are hexed with clumsiness. The next time each foe attacks, the attack is interrupted and that foe suffers 76 damage. So if that was a little confusing, basically clumsiness is a hex that is applied in an area of effect, and it lasts for 4 seconds. If you attack while clumsiness is on you, your attack is interrupted and you take 76 damage. Sometimes much higher, because illusion magic obviously can go higher than 12. So this one is a 5. If I'm in illusion magic, this is part of why. This can apply a lot of additional damage. It is, of course, very heavy on your energy pool, and it will have a pretty severe penalty that way, because 10 energy on an 8-second recharge is going to use up your energy pretty quickly. And fast casting makes that recharge even lower, obviously. This is an interesting spell to be in the game, both to use and to be used against you. Obviously, it's not hard to not attack for 4 seconds, but you have to catch it before auto attacks swing. So it creates a little bit of interesting play when you're on the receiving end. This will... Like, and part of the reason to bring clumsiness is casters will auto attack, and this can just deal a lot of additional damage. Or this can just deal a lot of damage. It's an area of effect. It reduces damage to you a little bit by interrupting the attack, so the attack doesn't actually land. If it catches an attack skill, it's even better. But this is really good for getting a lot of additional damage in, and it gets additional damage in on like physical attackers that would not otherwise be casting spells. That's something like notably mistrust would trigger on. Although there is actually another skill that's more of an analogy to mistrust. So anyway, clumsiness is a very effective damage skill. And it's an interesting design as well. It again plays into that space of like, well, you can, but you really shouldn't. That empathy kind of plays into. I like to have an illusion mesmer and a domination mesmer, with illusion mesmer using things like clumsiness. And this spell that we'll see later down here, Wandering Eye. And the domination mesmer bringing more of the interrupt package and things like that. So, okay. Confusing images. So this is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 20-second recharge, hex spell. For 8 seconds, target foe takes twice as long to activate non-attack skills. So, for reference, Arcane Conundrum makes spells take twice as long to cast for a little period of time, for 13 seconds, at 10 energy, and a 2-second cast time, and a 20-second recharge. Those stats might sound pretty familiar with that one. But it also gives you energy when the hex ends. Confusing Images makes all skills that aren't attack skills take twice as long to activate. So this is going to affect your signets. This is going to affect your generic skills that have an activation time, which aren't... Something like Troll Unguent takes for friggin' ever if that's if they have confusing images on them. 8 seconds is pretty short. This is a single target. This is basically bad Arcane Conundrum. This is a 1. I'm going to be blunt. I don't know when I would ever want this effect. Like, I don't know when I'd want confusing images. All it does is make a foe take longer to activate some of their skills. If it's spells I'm caring about, something like Arcane Conundrum is strictly better because it lasts longer, is area of effect, and returns me energy. And I don't know when I would ever want this. So here we are. Confusing Images. It's well named. It confuses me. Why would I want this? This would need to do something else to be worth using. And I don't know what that is. But, because here's the thing, right? If it affected attack skills, it would be marginally better. The thing is, like, so part of the reason why the chant and shout clause is a detriment is because there's a lot of attack skills that you can't interrupt with those. Whereas there's not that many non-attack skills that aren't spells, and especially not chance, that you would want to take longer to activate. So yeah, this is really targeting a niche or like a set of skills that Arcane Conundrum already targets a smaller category, but plentiful enough of them that I don't know why I would ever want to use Confusing Images, especially not with the same stats that Arcane Conundrum has in terms of energy, cast time, and recharge. So yeah, this is, I don't know what role this is playing. Conjure Nightmare. Conjure Nightmare being an upgrade to Conjure Phantasm. We'll talk about them both, obviously. Conjure Nightmare is 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, which is pretty low, but 15 energy is a huge amount of energy. Spell, it's a hex spell. For 13 seconds, target foe suffers -8 health degeneration. So -8 health degeneration is quite a lot. That works out to 16 HP per second. This is obviously armor ignoring damage. 13 seconds of 16 damage is going to be, let's see, quite a lot. I'm going to go with quite a lot. I'm not sure the exact math off the top of my head. Let's see, 169 plus 3 times, so plus 39. That's going to be about 200 damage, I guess, is what this is going to do all told. So Conjure Nightmare to me is like a 3. The effect is potent, but the energy cost is 2. So here's the thing. This is a single target, makes that target really lose a lot of health. But like, I don't care. Like, it's so we'll compare this to Crippling Anguish, right? Because Crippling Anguish we'll see in just a bit. Crippling Anguish is somewhat comparable to Conjure Nightmare because they both are a huge amount of health degeneration. The problem with Conjure Nightmare is it's too much energy. That is the problem with Conjure Nightmare. This effect is strong, but 15 energy is just way too much to pay for it. And that is like, the fact that this is a single target is a contributor to that, but like 15 energy, really? I don't have room for that in my bar. I can't afford 15 energy, not for this effect. Maybe for something really special and potent, but like, so Elementalist has a lot of really powerful energy management that like makes all of their spells way cheaper. That's what the attunements do. And so Elementalist 15 energy is perfectly reasonable. But for other casters, such as the Mesmer, like Necromancer can kind of get around 15 energy cost as well because its primary attribute is ludicrously powerful energy management. But the other casters of like Mesmer and Ritualist and Monk especially, like 10 energy is kind of expensive. 15 is really pricey. Like, Conjure Nightmare is just way too expensive to use. So this is something where it's really important to kind of take into consideration some of these things. Now, it should be noted that things like health degeneration actually are relatively stronger. I mean, all damage is relatively stronger. But when against lower level foes, when they have less max HP, all damage is better there. So Conjure Nightmare can look really impressive in those situations where you're casting it on like something with that's at like level 3 with like 120 HP or whatever it is, 160, something like that, 140. Bleeding even looks impressive in those situations with how quickly it makes health bars fall. But like, yeah, I've spent too long on this one. It's way too much energy for the effect. Conjure Phantasm is similarly a 3. So the only reason why this is a 3 and not lower is because it is... So let me read it. It's 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, hex spell. For 13 seconds, target foe experiences -5 health degeneration. So Conjure Nightmare, aside from the fact that Conjure Nightmare is suffer and Conjure Phantasm is experience, they're very similar. Conjure Phantasm's 5 health degeneration for 10 energy. That's 10 HP per second. It's going to be 130 damage. Conjure Nightmare is 5 more energy for 3 more pips of health degeneration. Obviously, Conjure Nightmare is preferable in the sense that it causes more health degen. Conjure Phantasm, I will say this, is kind of like your signature illusion magic spell. It's the one that you get like really early in prophecies, for example. And like it kind of stands out as like, oh, here's some of the benefits of health degeneration and things like that. But 10 energy is still kind of expensive, but it's less overly expensive than 15 energy. I would like to see this be 5 energy and last like... I mean, just being 5 energy would be fine. Conjure Nightmare would be acceptable at like 7 or 8 energy. Conjure Phantasm is acceptable at like 5 energy, if I'm being blunt about it. Maybe at 6. Like, the 5-second recharge is pretty quick. But yeah, like... It's fine, but like the effect is just not that impressive. So this is one of those skills that's a bit overpriced for what it does. Skills like that are kind of dangerous to have in the game. Skills that, because this skill looks stronger than it is, or can look stronger than it is, and skills like that, and Conjure Nightmares similarly, they're very dangerous to have in the game because, so there's different alignments of skills. So there's skills that are stronger than they look. And there's skills that are weaker than they look. Then there's skills that are as powerful as they look, and skills that are as weak as they look. So it's an optics. It's an initial impression versus actual reality. The problem with something like Conjure Phantasm and Conjure Nightmare is that they are skills that are weaker than they look. And skills that are weaker than they look are like, you want to avoid that category. It's okay to have skills that are weak and look weak. It's okay to have skills that are strong and look strong. And it's okay to have skills that look weak but are strong. But if you have skills that look strong but aren't, unless somebody can actually kind of identify as they're playing that, wait, this skill isn't really paying off as well as I thought it would, you're going to have situations where this is particularly bad as new players. New players are going to have a harder time at the game because they have poor or less effective, less good, less experienced, obviously, skill evaluation. And so when you give them something like Conjure Phantasm early, you give them a skill that and present it as a skill that can seem strong to them, they're going to bring it on their bars, and then they're going to be less effective than if they had brought a skill that did more. Like, it's the same thing in Magic the Gathering, right? It's a powerful consideration. You want, like, a card like Tarmogoyf that looks weak or hard to evaluate at first, but as you play with it, if you give it a chance, you discover that's very strong. That's okay. But if you have something that looks really strong, but turns out to be really weak, that can be a problem because it makes the experience more difficult for them. They perform less well, and that's especially true in a game like this. Like, new players to Magic, you can kind of calibrate around some of that. But a lot of the enemies in the game, like, especially as you get later into the game, if you did not figure out that something like Conjure Phantasm is not pulling its weight, you're going to have problems. You're not going to be sure why you're always out of energy. You're going to have a hard time actually doing the things that your profession wants to do. And so I'm going to talk about this a lot with the Monk as well, but Conjure Phantasm is kind of a trap. It's a trap for new players because it can seem kind of good or even strong, and then they're spending all of their energy on a skill that's like mediocre and not really pulling its energy weight. And that's going to be a problem for them because it's going to make the game harder because they're going to be running up against walls that other players that have better builds are not going to run into. So that's just something where you really want to be careful in your design to try to avoid doing. So like I said, I'm going to talk about that a lot when we get to the Monk, because they have a couple of skills there too that are in the same sort of space. But I just wanted to address that now because it's a really important design consideration when designing something like this. Okay, that brings us to Crippling Anguish. So this is 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 12-second recharge. So it's a decently long recharge. Elite Hex spell relative to the previous. You'll see why I'm... Let me just read it here. Elite Hex spell. For 17 seconds, target moves and attacks 50% slower and suffers -7 health degeneration. So this is very similar to Conjure Nightmare and Conjure Phantasm on the surface in that it causes health degeneration for a hefty period of time. Now, obviously, this is an elite skill, but it makes, like, that elite skill is really, like, it earns that elite status. So Conjure Nightmare... This sits somewhere in terms of health degeneration, kind of in between. You can actually get this up to like 8 or 9 health degen. It lasts longer than either of them. It does have a longer recharge, but it also makes the target move and attack slower, which is huge. Moving slower means that it's much easier to get away from them or catch up with them, either way. And attacking slower means that they're not able to get in as many hits. They're not going to deal as much damage. Only being 5 energy is a massive benefit. This does have 100% uptime if you want to target one foe. And the 12-second recharge difference is just not that huge of a deal. It is there. It's definitely there. But this is very powerful. This is a 4 for me. It's obviously not area of effect, but it basically says that enemy, screw that enemy. And especially if they're a physical attacker, because especially if they're in melee, they're not going to be able to catch up with anybody. If they do catch up with them, they're going to like be attacking really slow, so they're going to do a lot less damage. And they're going to be continuously losing health, and it lasts for a long time. That's basically burning damage, right? That's 14 damage per second. For 17 seconds, that's going to deal quite a lot of damage, too. So this is a very strong skill in those regards. Its downside, of course, is that it is single target, which is a downside. That said, I'm actually happy to run this on a secondary Mesmer as well, just because the energy cost is fairly low. What you get out of it for the investment, even if I go down to like 10 investment, like 15 seconds duration is perfectly acceptable because the snare effects of this is really good. So this is a skill that I think is quite solid. It's not like the most standout one, but it's quite solid. So it is a contender for an illusion magic slot when I run that. Distortion. 5 energy, 8-second recharge, no activation time because it is a stance. For 4 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block attacks. Whenever you block an attack this way, you lose 2 energy or distortion ends. So if you don't have 2 energy to lose, distortion ends is how that works. This used to have slightly better stats on it in terms of duration and stuff, but it got nerfed because it was real good. It's still pretty solid. Actually, it was used by rangers sometimes in specific builds. Mesmers have run this. It's mostly useful in PvP. This is definitely and totally an option for knocking some pressure off of you instead of like a warrior stance or something that can do similar sorts of things. The energy loss, however, is definitely a consideration. This is a way of momentarily getting pressure off of you. This is a skill that I'm going to give. I'm torn between like a 2 and a 3. I think... So the reason why I'm kind of torn... like, this is a cool effect to have on a spellcaster, right? This is a spellcaster blocking stance. I think it used to be invasion, actually, but... The issue with this is... this effect is less exciting in PvE. I think it's still useful. But it's more important in PvP where you can like really stop yourself from being spiked down or something by like activating this quickly. So I'm not quite sure where to rate it. I think I'm going to give it a 2, just because while it's good at doing the thing that it does, it's just not something that I'm going to want a lot of the time, if that makes sense. And if I'm dipping into an attribute line for this sort of effect, I'm probably going to want to dip into tactics or something like discipline stance or one of those other options there, rather than for distortion. So it's a cool effect though, and I appreciate that Mesmer has something like this. It kind of plays into the feel of what the profession is. Ethereal Burden. Now, before I read this, I'm going to point out that Kitta's Burden, factions, duplicates, etc. Hopefully you know that drill by now. I already talked about it with Ancestor's Visage. So these are the same skill, Ethereal Burden and Kitta's Burden. They are both 15 energy, 1.5 second cast times, 30-second recharge. Hex spell for 10 seconds, target foe moves 50% slower. When Ethereal Burden ends or Kitta's Burden ends, you gain 16 energy. So they kind of refund themselves after 10 seconds. But, so, here's the thing. I talked about this with Elementalist and some of the skills there. often I just don't want a snare like this. Now, I will say that I think both of these skills are better than Imagined Burden, which is very similar, lasts longer but does not refund energy. Refunding energy is, in my opinion, much better than what Imagined Burden does. I don't like any of these skills, though, particularly much. If I want a snare effect, I'm probably bringing something like Deep Freeze and Water Magic on a different character. So I'm going to give both of these 2s just because I think that they're okay. Because of the refunding energy. Now I need to go figure out where Kita's Burden is in my list. Here it is. So I'm generally not going to bring these because this effect is generally not something that I want, but I think that there are worse snaring options than one that refunds its energy. That's really what it comes down to. Fevered Dreams. So Fevered Dreams is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 10-second recharge, elite hex spell. For 22 seconds, whenever target foe suffers from a new condition, all foes in the area suffer from that condition as well. If target foe has 2 or more conditions, that foe is dazed for 3 seconds. So that's when you apply this. If they already have at least 2 conditions, then it inflicts dazed. That's a nice little bonus. Fevered Dreams is a powerful skill for a condition pressure build. This is a very specific sort of build. I really like having this sort of skill on that build. There are some non-attribute skills that I'd bring with it. There is another elite skill that you might consider using instead that is in Inspiration Magic. Extend Conditions, which spreads all conditions from your from target foe to all foes near your target and increases their duration. That's an option. It plays well also with Hypochondria, which transfers all conditions from foes in the area to your target foe. So you can apply Fevered Visions, was that the name, I believe? Yeah, Fevered Dreams, that's what it is. You could apply this to somebody and then use that to pull all conditions to them and then spread them out again. This is a very specific build, works with a skill just below it called Fragility. I think that this is a 2 because, like, yes, it's powerful in a very specific build. That build can be kind of strong. So, in general, the sort of build that Fever Dreams and, again, Fragility are good in is a build where that's not... Like, you don't want to take that build to an area that has a lot of non-fleshy enemies because that build really relies on conditions, and you're cutting out 3 conditions of bleed, poison, and disease, which are all really useful. I am going to, in various points, talk about this build, this sort of condition build, and Fevered Dreams and especially Fragility are cornerstones of that build to get a lot of additional damage out of it. And so you are going to hear that come up in other profession videos and stuff like that. This is very useful for that build because it really does help spread conditions around quite a bit. And of course, 22 seconds, you can keep this up on like 2, maybe even 3 enemies at once. So that's very, very strong. And I definitely think this is probably the stronger elite for that particular build. So something to keep in mind if you are making that team build. That said, that build does have some areas where you definitely don't want to bring it. Okay, Fragility. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 5-second recharge, very low. Hex spell. For 18 seconds, target and adjacent foes take 17 damage each time they suffer or recover from a new condition. So, this is a 2. It is a very solid 2. If you are making the condition build, this is really good. Even if you are taking some of the angles of it, like let's say you're doing something where you are AoE applying some sort of condition, this can be okay. But this really shines in a build where you are specifically applying conditions to enemies, and then either there are short duration conditions, so a lot of burning, for example, tends to be very short duration, where they start burning, they take 17 damage, armor ignoring obviously, then 2 or 3 seconds later they stop burning and take another hit of damage. This adds up, this can rack up. There's a Dervish Elite that can apply disease for just a few seconds. That works really well with this. Obviously, anything that's applying conditions in an area of effect, such as Fever Dreams, works really well with this. There are some skills. The Elementalist has a skill, and the Dervish has a skill that remove conditions and do additional damage for that. That also works well with Fragility. That build can be very strong. It can do a lot of damage and a lot of additional pressure just from all of the health degeneration and debilitating effects from the conditions, as well as the damage that Fragility stacks on top of adding those and having them removed from things and stuff like that. That build can be very, very strong. Fragility is the cornerstone of that build. That build does lose some flare against enemies that are not fleshy and therefore are immune to bleeding, poison, and disease, just because it cuts out a bunch of additional conditions you can be triggering Fragility with. You are making a team build with this. You are not making like a character that uses Fragility. You are making a team that uses Fragility. Keep that in mind. It's a fun build to work with. But yeah, so that's Fragility. I really like a skill like this, though, that says, hey, take this angle, do this specific thing. And having build around me's like Fragility is really good for this type of game. It's really good for any sort of a game where you have more intense build craft like this, like Magic the Gathering, or other card games with deck building, anything like that. Having skills that say, build around me and I will amplify the power of other skills and thus allow you to be able to approach the game differently. That's really strong. That's really good. Fragility plays into that, and I think that's awesome. So, Frustration. So this is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 7 second recharge. Expel. For 17 seconds, target foe casts spells 50% slower and takes 41 damage whenever interrupted. If a skill is interrupted, Frustration deals double damage. Okay, so that last line might be a little confusing. So it says they take 41 damage whenever they're interrupted. They can have their auto attacks interrupted. So that's really important to remember. That's where the 41 damage comes from. If it's specifically a skill that's getting interrupted, it'll deal 82 damage instead. I don't use this. Partly it's single target, partly it's the energy cost. This is actually probably something that could work really well in specific situations. So, for example, there's a Ritualist Spirit called Dissonance that causes interrupt. It can probably deal a lot of damage with Panic as well, if that's going on. Or there can be some other Ritualist stuff that allows you to like interrupt more regularly. If you are actually interrupting their auto-attacking, I think that this starts to become a lot more attractive. Even though it only deals 41 damage when you do that, that's something that you can interrupt a lot more often, and that can add up a lot of additional damage. And the fact that every now and then it will hit for a higher amount, that's really cool. I haven't really used this much. It feels a little finicky to me. I would not bring this just to augment my interrupting spells that I have as a Mesmer, like Cry of Frustration. I would bring this specifically if I'm making a build that's going to kind of more randomly throw out interrupts. I'm going to give this a 2, largely. Like, I think if it was an AoE, it would be bumped up, but the fact that it's kind of high energy cost at 10 energy, and only affects one foe is going to make this a little bit more pricey than it's worth. The damage that it can do is nice, but you are having to put in a good bit of additional effort to actually get that to proc at any sort of like frequency that would make you happy. Proc being the effect occurs. Illusion of Haste. So there's going to be a couple of illusion skills here, like called Illusion of something, where they do a thing and then they kind of undo the thing, if that makes sense. So Illusion of Haste is a speed buff type 1. This is 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 5 second recharge, enchantment spell. For 10 seconds, you are no longer crippled. So if you're crippled, crippled ends. In other words, it cures you if crippled. And you move 33% faster. When Illusion of Haste ends, you become crippled for 3 seconds. Okay, so this spell is not very good. There's a couple of reasons why. One of them is when it ends, you become crippled. That's super awkward. Like, basically, you're going to start moving slower after this ends if you don't just immediately use it again. It only lasts 10 seconds, and while it does have 100% uptime, the thing is, you still have to cast it, and that casting stops you from moving. So, I don't like it from that standpoint. Removing crippled is nice, but the fact that you have to recast it after it ends or you're going to be slower for 3 seconds, like, snaring yourself off of when your speed skill ends is not great. So I'm going to give this a 1. And the reason why I'm giving this 1 is, like, it does kind of do the thing that it's supposed to do, but bluntly, there are other options that are better. Stormjin's haste is a much better option in the elementalist line. And that one you still have to stop to cast. There are, if you're just trying to get speed up, for like running somewhere or something, and you have access to Onslaught, that's a better choice. There are some Ranger stances that are better choices for speeding yourself up long term. Storm Chaser, for example. So Illusion of Haste is just a little too clunky to use. I like the idea of what it's trying to do, of saying, oh, you look like you're faster, and then when it ends, oh, you pay the price and now you're slower. But it's a little clunky, and there are significantly better ways of trying to get this effect, so I'm just not a huge fan of it. Illusion of Pain. So 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 5-second recharge, Hex spell. For 8 seconds, target foe has -9 health degeneration and takes 9 damage each second. When Illusion of Pain ends, that foe is healed for 103. So, this is going to... So, the -9 HP degeneration is very powerful, and the 9 additional damage on top of it is basically kind of like giving you another 4.5 pips of health degeneration. That goes past the health degen that's already there. So, this is kind of doing... in effect, let's do some mental math, 27 damage per second for 8 seconds. That's a lot. This really drops somebody's HP bar quite quickly. That said, they're going to recover about half of the damage you dealt to them when this ends. In general, you're going to try to apply this and hope that it's going to kill them before that happens. The fact that it halves the damage it deals, or effectively kind of halves it. So for 8 seconds, 27 is going to be, so 25 times 8 is 200, and then you have the additional 2 damage per each of those, so that's going to be like 116 damage, something like that. This 216 damage is about what this heals, so 103 is about half of that. Recovering about half of that damage puts this weaker than Conjure Phantasm for the same energy cost, same recharge. Obviously, this casts a little bit slower. If you are able to get the enemy killed within that time that this is going, obviously that's good. But honestly, this is kind of worse than those, unless you're trying to specifically build around it, and then that case is very fiddly. I'm going to give this a 2, because I'm going to be honest, you're doing a lot of working with this to try to make it work. It's a cool idea for a skill. You definitely don't want it to end early, but it's very finicky, and again, it's a little too expensive for its effect. So I just don't like this sort of thing. Single target, all that sort of business as well. Illusion of Weakness. This is a weird one. So this is 10 energy, 2-second cast time, 30-second recharge, enchantment spell. You lose 202 health. Okay, that's painful. Illusion of Weakness ends if damage drops your health below 25% of your maximum. When Illusion of Weakness ends, you gain 202 health. Okay, so there's a couple of things to point out about this. First of all, this has no definite duration. It'll end whenever you change a zone, obviously, because everything on you ends. You start out fresh when that happens. But... well, mostly fresh. You keep any death penalty, stuff like that, but that's another business. So this is a really interesting skill. If it gets removed from you, you'll gain health, and if your HP goes below 25%, i.e. you appear to be weak, you gain 202 health. 202 health obviously is a huge chunk of your HP. It's probably not quite half, but it's around 40%. And so that's a huge buffer. That said, this effect is not one that you generally want. If you do want it, it's a very good choice in that regard, so I'm going to give it a 2. It effectively gives you that amount of health additional. You do need to either wait for your HP to regenerate after you use it or heal up or something like that. But it reminds me kind of like a reverse version of some of those like Illusions of Grandeur magic enchantments, magic gathering enchantments. But Yeah, if you want this effect, if you want this additional durability, this is a fine way of getting it. There are some other options that this is sort of better than. The fact that it's indefinite duration is, of course, important. If it did not have indefinite duration, it would be probably a 1. But, you know, if you want this effect, this is a perfectly fine way of getting it. It's just you rarely want that effect. So, there we are. Illusionary weaponry. 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 25-second recharge, elite enchantment spell. For 30 seconds, your melee attacks neither hit nor fail to hit. Instead, illusionary weaponry deals 34 damage to your targets for each melee attack. You have +5 armor for each equipped illusion magic skill. That armor thing was an addition to this skill. It did not originally have that. So this one's a weird one. Basically, what it says is you're going to want to attack in melee range with a melee weapon. So a scythe is a really good choice with this because it hits in an AoE. But your attacks don't exactly hit, so you'll deal 34 damage. Anything that would, like, you can't miss, you can't be blocked, right? Your attacks neither hit nor fail to hit. It's weird, right? So the not failing to hit part means that whenever you make a melee attack, if it wasn't interrupted, it will deal 34 damage. But not hitting means that things like Vampiric or Zealous do not trigger, and you also do not gain adrenaline. Further, not hitting means that attack skills do not deal additional damage. Now, that said, something like Cyclone Axe is useful because Cyclone Axe, if you bring it, will cause you to attack in an area of effect. You'll deal 34 damage to each of your targets, if I remember correctly. So this kind of works with some skills like that, but for the most part, it does not work with any skills. This is a super 2. This is very much so a build around me. You are wanting to build in a way that this is useful. I believe there might be some weird assassin shenanigans with some of the assassin skills that I would have to check to see if this combos with some dagger stuff. I should probably do that. But let's go ahead and kind of move on for now. So yeah, this is very strange. You do need to get up in your enemy's face. You do not have to spec into the weapon that you're using because you're not going to be hitting with that weapon's damage anyway. You can use this on secondary professionals, so like you could theoretically use this on a warrior or something, or an assassin if you wanted to. You could, for crying out loud, if you really wanted to, you could use this on an elementalist and just walk up to enemies' faces with illusionary weaponry and attack them with a scythe, and use other elementalist skills. So there are certainly applications for this. This is a very weird, quirky build-around type of skill, and you're doing some unusual stuff. So let's go ahead and see if I have a pair of daggers on this character. I do, technically. And let's see if I have any of the dagger. No, I don't. Well, this will allow us to be able to test something. So I'm going to go do that. Okay, so what we're testing here is, not that. If I use... Okay, so this just fails and does not deal damage. The way Fox Fang works is, it's a whole thing with how assassin skills work. I think there might have been something at one point in time where it did have some sort of crazy synergies, but it looks like this just fails and doesn't deal the damage. So that was an important thing to check. I kind of suspected that would be the case, but I wanted to verify, because if it did have synergy with assassin skills failing like that, you can get some really crazy stuff like insane attack rates and stuff like that. But I think that's something that they might have learned at one point in time and specifically modified the game to make sure that didn't happen, if that makes sense. So I'm glad to have tested that just to verify that is the case. Okay, we have established ourselves back in our little roost. So let's go ahead and move on with Images of Remorse. So this is 5 energy, 2-second cast time, 5-second recharge, hex spell. For 9 seconds, target foe suffers -3 health degeneration. If that foe was attacking, that foe takes 44 damage. I give this one a 4. It's not, to be clear, it's not amazing, but it does pretty reliably, again, attacking is something that happens quite a lot. It does pretty reliably deal that 44 damage, and the health regeneration that it causes is there. It's basically like a 9-second bleed. This is fine, and definitely better than Conjure Phantasm. The degen's obviously not quite as strong, but the fact that it likely causes that 44 upfront damage is a lot more appealing, and the fact that it only costs 5 energy is also a lot more appealing. So I'm not quite sure where this gets if you have more illusion magic, but the duration and the health degen both scale, so it could potentially get to be reasonably okay. I'd need to check breakpoints though on that health degen. But yeah, so this is one that's okay, and I will sometimes bring it, but it's not like an auto slot or anything. Imagined Burden. I alluded to this one earlier. So this is 15 energy, 1 second cast time, 30-second recharge, hex spell. For 18 seconds, target foe moves 50% slower. This is kind of like a hex version of a cripple for 18 seconds, except because this hex is a little bit harder to remove. This is a 1. Like, okay, if I want a snare like this, I would prefer one of the 2 burdens. So like Kitta's Burden, which we already talked about, it's got almost identical stats to Imagine Burden. The cast speed difference is pretty negligible. Obviously, Imagine Burden lasts a lot longer, but Kitta's Burden, the thing is it refunds your energy. But the thing is, Imagine Burden is basically outclassed by like Deep Freeze or something like that. If I'm going to be bringing a snare, I'm going to either be bringing like a ranger that has a cripple effect. Most likely, I will actually be bringing a water elementalist with water magic hexes. They snare long enough, thank you very much, and snare a little bit stronger, usually 66% rather than 50%. And hit an AoE. Does not hit an AoE. I don't like Imagine Burden because it is very single target specific and quite weak. So, there are other options for snares that do not cost so much energy and do not have such long recharges. Yeah, that's the skills problems right there. Ineptitude. 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 15-second recharge, elite hex spell. For 4 seconds, the next time target foe or any adjacent foe attacks, they take 114 damage, which is armor ignoring, and are blinded for 10 seconds. Okay, so this is kind of like an elite version of Clumsiness. I'm also going to give this one a 4. I don't always bring this. It is certainly a strong consideration. I also will like bring psychic instability and stuff like that on my illusion mesmers. Ineptitude is... So its effect is very powerful. It is AoE, so adjacent foes are hexed with this. So basically, if this is on you, it reads, if you attack in the next 4 seconds, you'll take 114 damage and are blinded. It does not stop the attack from happening. Blind is a 90% chance to miss, so it is likely that any attack performed when Ineptitude is on you will miss, but it will happen. So there's a 10% chance that it will hit. The damage on this is very high. The energy cost and recharge are a little bit on the large side. Keeping in mind that obviously fast casting will speed up this recharge, so probably this is more like a 10-second recharge or so under those circumstances. So this is a nice complement to Clumsiness. They work nicely together. The blind is super nice, that last 10 seconds. So this is a very solid elite. It's a very solid, another in those lines of like punishing you for doing specific action type skills. Just keep in mind that there is a 10% chance that the attack will hit, but obviously it stops the subsequent attacks for a little while, or reduces likelihood that they'll hit. So this has some damage mitigation effects built in as well. To some extent, this becomes less useful if you're bringing a Blinding Surge Elementalist, as that's another good way of getting Area of Effect blind. But this is a solid option, and certainly one that I'm happy to run quite often. Kitta's Burden I already talked about. Migraine. So Migraine is 10 energy, 2-second recharge, or 2-second cast time, 12-second recharge, excuse me. It is an elite hex spell. For 17 seconds, target foe suffers -7 health, degeneration, and takes 100% longer to activate all skills. This is strong-ish. So taking twice as long to activate their skills, which is what 100% longer is a useful effect. It makes interrupting easier, and it makes certainly getting off their skills, it just slows them down a bit. The health degeneration is nice. I would consider using this more often if this was 5 energy, but 10 energy is kind of a lot. It's okay. It's a 3. I don't hate it, but honestly, it has a lot of the same problems that Conjure Phantasm has. This is kind of like... So, if Conjure Nightmare was 5 energy cheaper and elites lasted longer and made skills slower to activate, that's kind of where this is at. I'm not a huge fan of just giving health degen. Like, health degen is strong, but single target health degen is... There are a lot of ways of kind of accumulating that. And so I'd rather get it from, like, spreading conditions around, because those tend to be a lot cheaper to spread around and to multiple targets and things like that. Or there's additional benefits from them that you can trigger stuff from. Spending my elite slot on what is mostly health degen and making my interrupts easier is just not quite worth it. So, like, it's okay. I don't hate it, but it's just... Generally, there are a lot better options. And if you just want health degen, recurring insecurity is an option. I'm going to want to, frankly, bring Crippling Anguish. I had to look at the skill's name. Crippling Anguish over this most of the time that I would consider this sort of effect. And part of that is the energy cost. Crippling Anguish is only 5 energy. This is 10. That's a huge difference. I would much, much, much more strongly consider bringing this skill if it was only 5 energy. Phantom Pain. Hex spell. It's 5 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge. For 10 seconds, target foe suffers -3 health degeneration. When Phantom Pain ends, regardless of how it ends, that foe suffers a deep wound for 17 seconds. I described deep wound here. So Phantom Pain is a very minor health degen. That's 60 damage, which is okay, but it's kind of slow. This is a 2, however, because it combos really well with... There's a couple of Mesmer spells. I already talked about one in Domination Magic. Shatter Delusions. That ends a hex. There's another one in Inspiration Magic that also ends a hex. This is like the premier skill to combo with those. By itself, I wouldn't consider running it. The effect is just kind of a little too weak. The health like 3 health degeneration is just a little too weak. Other things, by the way, that are against something like a Migraine or a Phantom Pain is that there is a cap of 10 health pips, either degeneration or regeneration. So you can't really like stack them beyond a certain point. And certainly this is a kind of a weak one. And I'm not terribly excited in that. So if I'm bringing this as like a hex to shatter on my opponent and inflict a deep wound, that's really cool. Like, when this reads 5 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge, target foe has a hex that you can shatter, and when you do, they get deep wound, then it's great. Don't play this for the health degen. So, build around. Recurring insecurity, 10 energy, 1-second cast time, 10-second recharge. Elite hex spell. For 10 seconds, target foe suffers -4 health degeneration. If that foe has another hex when recurring insecurity would end, it is reapplied. Okay. This is a skill that's a big skill tester. It's not very good. It can sound amazing, because if you best case scenario it, all of your enemies have this on and some other hex, and they're just like constantly in health degeneration, and it's amazing. In practice, you are having to keep track of what enemies have recurring insecurity on them, so you're not reapplying it to enemies that already have it, and you're having to make sure that hexes are flowing around on the enemy team enough to keep this up. It's just a massive headache to try to get this working well. Migraine up there, a couple of skills. So this is just, it's more trouble than it's worth, is really what it comes down to. I don't think you're going to be getting as much benefit out of this as you want. It's a cool design. It's a cool build around me. My main issues with it are the energy cost to the healthy generation is just a really bad ratio. If this was like 3 energy, it would be more interesting. If this was 5 energy, it'd be more interesting. If it had like 5 or 6 healthy gen. I really want this to be an elite Conjure Phantasm sort of skill. But for that, it needs to be having slightly more healthy gen. Now, I can probably bump it up to a acceptable level if I really tried with Illusion Magic. I might be able to get to 5, possibly 6. But this really needs to be at hitting like 5 or 6 health degen, or like 5 health degen at 5 energy with like a 7-second recharge for me to actually consider this skill. So as it is, I'm honestly going to give this a 1. I don't even think this scenario where you're actually spreading it around. I think that's just way too much work for the payoff that you're getting from it. So I wouldn't want to bother with it. I would want to bring some other elite that is more effective, and has more of a clear job, and that sort of thing. Something that's just health degen like this needs to have better stats, and that includes energy cost, recharge, amount of health degen, like all of those sorts of things, for me to actually consider bringing this. I think this skill could be pushed up to usable levels, by the way. I do think that could happen, where it's like competing at a fine spot. Because all it is raw health degen, it really has to be kind of aggressive to get there. And the fact that it reapplies itself is a nice bonus. Trying to build around that is going to be really finicky, and you're going to be running up to health degen caps anyway. So I think that there are better options, and I just don't think this is powerful enough. I like the idea it's playing at. It needs to be pushed a bit more. Shared Burden. This is what Imagined Burden wants to be. It's 5 energy, 2-second cast time, 15-second recharge, so much, much shorter than Imagined Burden. It is an elite hex spell for 17 seconds, so it is permanently upkeepable, 17 seconds being longer than 15 seconds. Target foe and all nearby foes attack, cast spells, and move 50% slower. This is a huge snaring effect, big area of effect. This is quite strong in that regard. It's got the problem of I don't usually want this effect. Again, Deep Freeze is an area of effect snare that does damage and snares a bit harder. You can get a lot of these effects by mixing and matching stuff from other professions that are non-elites, and there are other professions that are doing additional things. So, for example, I can get the snare with Deep Freeze and the attack speed decrease with some Necromancer hexes, like Shadow of Fear, and there's another one that I don't use because it's like marginally better effects for huge more cost. So Shadow of Fear. Those sorts of skills will do this effect non-elite in off of other professions. Obviously, you can save your team some build space by bringing this, but you are using your elite slot on something that is fundamentally not actually increasing the damage you're dealing to enemies, per se. This will mitigate enemy damage a little bit by making them attack slower and move slower. And moving slower obviously allows you to catch them. So this one's okay. I'm going to give this one a 3. I'm not unhappy to run this, but the thing is, there are other elites that I'm going to want to run most of the time when I am in Illusion Magic. For example, the Interrupt, Psychic Instability, and Fast Casting, or like Ineptitude, or Crippling Anguish. So it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly serviceable. The area of effect on it's enormous, but it's just a little... Like, all of these effects together you think would be kind of worth it, but it's kind of, like, merely okay. Shrinking Armor, 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 8-second recharge. Hex spell for 10 seconds, target foe suffers -3 health regeneration. When this hex ends, that foe has cracked armor for 17 seconds. So this is very similar to Phantom Pain. Phantom Pain is better in so much as Deep Wound is a significantly better condition than cracked armor. That said, I'm okay with this just because its recharge is a bit quicker and it does have that on-end effect. That's nice. I'm going to give this a 2, though, because I'm never using this if I'm not bringing it to deliberately remove it to inflict cracked armor. Like, this is an awkward way to try to inflict cracked armor on anything, unless you're trying to remove it, in which case, like, basically you're bringing this because it has a nice effect when it ends, not for the health degen, and just because its recharge is lower than Phantom Pain, which makes it a lot more appealing. So it's fine for that role and pretty awful otherwise. But you need skills like this that can kind of like be synergistic skills rather than powerful skills, where like their power is in the synergy that they have with other skills that then work together to make them strong. And it's important to have those sorts of skills. So it's good that something like Shrinking Armor and Phantom Pain exist because they play into specific archetypes, and allow those archetypes to work. So it's a good skill to have exist. It's just not a skill that I'd bring outside of that context. Signet of Clumsiness. Quarter-second activation time, 8-second recharge. It is a signet, so no energy cost or anything. Energy cost being the only... Yeah. There's some Necromancer signets that cost health. Anyway, if target foe is attacking, that foe and all adjacent foes are interrupted and take 51 damage. Any foes using attack skills are knocked down. Signet of Clumsiness is great. This is a 5. Very similarly to Unnatural Signet, where Unnatural Signet in Domination Magic basically just fits into into a Domination Magic bar really easily. This fits into an Illusion Magic bar really easily. It does what you want to do. Now, keep in mind the recharge is not improved by fast casting because it is not a spell, but this does damage in an area of effect. It interrupts attacks and attack skills, and it knocks down foes if they're using attack skills, which is a nice little bonus. This is a nice way to get additional damage in that does not cost you energy, and that's really what's important about this. Mesmer energy can be quite taxed because they do have a lot of spells that they're trying to cast. A lot of them are kind of in the 10 energy range, and so having a really useful, effective signet like this is a great way to add some additional utility to your bar that does not add energy burden, and that's exactly what you want. So I really like Signet of Clumsiness. It's really cool like that. Signet of Illusions is another signet, so no energy cost. It has a 2-second activation, a 5-second recharge. Keep in mind the activation time is decreased by fast casting. It is an elite signet. Your next 3 spells use your illusion attribute instead of their normal attribute. This is a 2, because it's super much so build around me. You are intentionally building your bar to be an awkward mess that Signet of Illusions makes work. You are giving up your elite slot for that. Note that this specifically works on spells, not just skills. And you do have to apply this to make it active. You are probably going to want 16 illusion magic to make optimal use of it. Both, I imagine it goes up to 4 activations at that level. I could check that, I guess. Where's my illusion magic hat? Here it is. So, Signet of Illusions, nope, it just stays 3. So there is an argument for getting it up to 16 just for the increased attributes that you'll be pouring into stuff, but this is a build around skill. You're intentionally, you're basically bringing this with no other illusion magic spells, and you're bringing other spells that you're using with this, and this adds a clunky routine of reapplying Signet of Illusions, that way you can get your spells off. Technically, you could use this on a non-Mesmer. I don't know why you would do that. There's some potential chance that you might want to use it to be able to use primary attribute spells, and that's an interesting area. But in general, this is a build around me. It's a cool, quirky skill. I like skills like this just because they add that additional, I wonder what I can do with this sort of thing. It's a very Johnny skill in that regard, Johnny Jenny, from the Magic Psychographics. So it's good to exist. It's not generally your most powerful skill or anything. Thank goodness, because it'd be a pain in the butt to play with if it was. But I like that it exists, and that's really cool. Soothing Images. This is a skill that is most annoying when enemies use it on you. It is 15 energy, 2-second cast time, 8-second recharge, hex spell. For 18 seconds, target foe and all adjacent foes cannot gain adrenaline. This is a hard shutdown to warriors. I don't actually like the design of this skill. Something like Sympathetic Visage or Ancestor's Visage, which I talked about previously, are more interesting designs because those say, oh, you want your adrenaline, you have to attack a different target. This lasts a long time. 18 seconds is a very long duration. You can keep this up indefinitely. I generally would not consider bringing this. The energy cost is just very high, and shutting down adrenaline skills like this is just not that valuable. You could theoretically bring it, but honestly, I'd rather kill the enemy, and bringing something like Clumsiness is better. I'm going to give this a 2 because the effect is very strong, and so it's a powerful counter if you are going into an area with a lot of adrenaline skills that you do want to be able to shut down. If they already have adrenaline, like, this does not empty their adrenaline, it just means they can't get more. So if they do have adrenaline already, they could use that, but then they can't get any more. But yeah, I don't like the design of this skill. I would much rather this be something where it's like, whenever they use an adrenaline skill, they lose all adrenaline, or something like that. That's more interesting. That means that they have to make choices about what skill they use. This design just says, no, you don't get to use adrenaline, and that hard shutdown is just uninteresting to me. It's unfun to be on the receiving end of. It's just kind of frustrating and irritating. It makes your build not work the way it's supposed to, and it doesn't present you any interesting choices. It just says no. And just saying no in this sort of way it's not a great design. This is like Ensnaring Bridge in Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that, which makes it hard for you to attack with creatures. It just kind of... Or Moat. It's even more like a moat. It just says, like, no, you can't do the thing that you are potentially building around, but if they're not building... Like, if they're not doing the thing that's commonly done, then this skill doesn't do anything. So, Soothing Images, I don't think is a good design. Because I don't think it doesn't make you have to take interesting up. Like, it's a powerful design, but it's not an interesting design. And I don't think this sort of effect enhances the game when it's powerful but uninteresting. And I think I would rather see something that's more interesting to play against, and is cheaper to cast. Like, I would much rather this be like 10 energy, or even like 5 energy even, but 10 energy is probably the spot where it'd end up being, of like, for 18 seconds or maybe 15 seconds, target foe and all adjacent foes lose all adrenaline whenever they use a skill or something like that. Like, that's more interesting to me. I think that's a better design, and that's where I'd rather it be. Okay, Sum of All Fears. 10 energy, 2 second cast time, 10 second recharge hex spell. For 8 seconds, target foe moves, attacks, and casts spells 33% slower. So this is kind of like a non-elite version of Shared Burden. It only affects one person. It's not quite as strong of an effect. Honestly, the skill is a little weak to me. This needs to be 5 energy, or last longer. It's okay. I'm going to give it a 3. I don't think it's bad. It certainly makes that one person not as effective, but it's just a little weak. I don't think it's quite as narrow as like a 2 or something like that. Obviously, Shared Burden is in a similar area. Shared Burden's problem is it takes up your elite slot. This doesn't take up your elite slot, so it's a little bit better than that, but the decreases that it has are noticeable. They matter. But it's just a little anemic. And it costs a little too much for how anemic it is. If it was 5 energy and 1 second cast time, it would probably still be a 3, but it would be a happier 3. So, I already talked about Sympathetic Visage earlier. This is the OG, by the way. Ancestor's Visage was the faction skill. Wandering Eye. 5 energy, 2 second cast time, 12 second recharge hex spell. For 4 seconds, the next time target foe attacks, that attack is interrupted, and all nearby foes, which does include them, I believe, take 94 damage. So this one's really good. I'm going to give this one a 5 as well. This usually goes on the bar alongside Clumsiness and things like that. Usually when I'm doing an Illusion Magic Mesmer, I'm bringing like Clumsiness, Wandering Eye, Signet of Clumsiness, possibly Ineptitude. It's going to be stuff to punish attacking. And this is one of those skills that does that. So this is a skill that just ends up on my Illusion Magic bar quite often. The effect is strong. It does a lot of armor ignoring damage. It's very similar to Mistrust for attacks. So, note it's any attack, it's auto attack. It doesn't require like attack skills or anything like that. So this is a really cool, really effective skill. A nice complement to Clumsiness. It's not quite the same thing as Clumsiness. It does have a nice big area of effect. Clumsiness hexes each individually. So that might have like some pros. This is cheaper. So that's some pros. It has a longer recharge. So they're not quite the same skill, but they are quite similar. And sometimes you want to load up on similar effects. So it's always nice to find a variant execution of something. And this is a variant execution of Clumsiness that I quite appreciate. So anyway, that's going to go ahead and wrap stuff up for illusion magic. So next time I'll talk about inspiration magic. Until then, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.